The Japanese emperor has arrived in Britain for his controversial state visit. Labour camp survivors say they'll dog him with protests, demanding compensation and a full apology. Northern Ireland plunges into its campaign for the new assembly with a warning from Downing Street of difficulties ahead. And the penalty save that put Charlton in the Premiership after a Wembley thriller. Good evening. Japan's Emperor Akihito arrived in Britain tonight, with Tony Blair appealing for him to be given a warm welcome and former prisoners of war promising anything but. British survivors of Japanese Second World War labour camps are planning a series of demonstrations throughout the Emperor's visit in their campaign to get compensation from the Japanese government and a full apology from the Emperor.
Emperor Akihito arrived in Britain tonight for a state visit which the British and Japanese governments hope will celebrate a relationship which Tony Blair says has never been better. Yet despite all the trade and investment and cultural links, it's a relationship which is still impaled on memories from more than half a century ago. The former prisoners of war are elderly now. Some are apologetic about their anger and a little awkward about their protest. But with their photos of how it was to be a prisoner of the Japanese, they are propelled by a burning sense of injustice.
It wasn't 50 years ago. To us, it was yesterday. It is still of utmost importance to us.
Some had brought the letter they received from the king when they came home from the war. Others told how 1 in 3 of those held in the Japanese prison camps had died, 8 times the death rate of those held by the Germans. Yet, they said, Japan has paid only 1/50th of the compensation paid by Germany. Joan Bully was 5 when the Japanese interned her and her mother.
I feel the Japanese owe us a debt of honour. I have not received 1 penny in compensation from the Japanese government, nor anything from our own British government.
But as today's British soldiers played the Japanese national anthem on horse guards in preparation for tomorrow's ceremonies, it is right to remember that many former prisoners believe it is time to seek reconciliation rather than compensation. And Japanese officials believe the majority of today's generation want to move on.
I'm counting on the sense of reason and dignity and courtesy on the part of the British people. And in fact, that is the characteristic of the British people, isn't it?
The ride down the Mall was rehearsed in empty streets at dawn. Tomorrow, when the household cavalry escorts the carriage containing Emperor Akihito and the Queen, the pavements will be crowded with more than 1,000 former prisoners of war who will turn their back on him. It is nothing personal, they say, just a sign, probably a final one, of a suffering that cannot be forgotten. This evening, some of those for whom that is so began a candlelit vigil outside the Japanese embassy. The Japanese insist that their constitution makes it impossible for the emperor to repeat the apology which has already been offered by 2 Japanese prime ministers. But there is nothing to prevent him during tomorrow night's state banquet from expressing his personal feelings. He's done it before. 6 years ago, he told the Chinese that he deeply deplored the wartime suffering inflicted on them. The wording is difficult, the phrasing will probably be brief, but it is thought that Emperor Akihito will try to ease at least some of the pain from more than 50 years ago. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News at Buckingham Palace.
Tony Blair has warned the people of Northern Ireland they may face setbacks and disappointments as they begin to build on the outcome of the referendum endorsing the Good Friday Agreement. In an article in the province's Belfast Telegraph newspaper this evening, Mr Blair said some groups might resort to violence, but that the yes vote would make it harder for them to operate.
Tony Blair says the firm victory of the Yes campaign in Saturday's referendum vote on the Stormont Agreement was the most pleasurable experience of his political life. But the Prime Minister is realistic about the chances of setbacks ahead. In his article for the Belfast Telegraph, Mr Blair reiterates that the government will show no mercy to those who ignore the vote and continue violence. There may be other more political difficulties down the road. Sinn Féin is under pressure from unionists to deliver more on the destruction of IRA arms, but it says this issue shouldn't monopolise people's attention.
Are they as informed on the equality issue? Are they as informed on the need for a gesture of goodwill, a confidence-building measure from the marching orders and from Mr. Trimble, not to saddle places like the Garbahi Road with unwanted parades? So the issue of decommissioning, we've spelled our position out on it. And let's move on to deal with all the other issues.
Sinn Féin also challenged the SDLP to agree a formal pact in next month's election to a new Northern Ireland Assembly, but the SDLP swiftly rejected the suggestion.
The reality is that the people have voted in great numbers for a new partnership right across the community and between the traditions. And the type of pact that is now being suggested, as I understand it, would be a pact within one sectional interest and would run totally contrary to the spirit of the agreement which the people have voted for.
The exchanges about electoral pacts and paramilitary disarmament are merely the opening salvos in the campaign for next month's Assembly election. Friday's vote may have made history, but the Northern Ireland parties barely have time to pause for breath before entering once again into the political fray. Mark Devonport, BBC News, Belfast.
The Saudi Arabian lawyer who represented the two British nurses accused of murdering the Australian nurse Yvonne Guilford has said they should seek compensation from the dead woman's brother. Deborah Parry and Lucille McLaughlin were freed last week by the Saudi authorities, but their lawyer Salah Al-Hajjalan said they should sue Frank Guilford for causing severe mental stress during their time in prison. Mr. Guilford had originally asked a Saudi court to exercise the death penalty in the case. Indonesia's new leader has taken the first steps in a reform program that could sweep away the legacy of decades of autocratic rule. President Habibie promised early parliamentary elections and ordered the release of two political prisoners detained by his predecessor, President Suharto.
They have overthrown their president. Now they are demanding freedom for the political prisoners he incarcerated. Two men have been released from this jail. One had been locked up for subversion, the other for calling Suharto a dictator. But 200 more remain inside, including Zanana Gusmao, leader of the campaign for East Timor's independence, who's been compared to Nelson Mandela.
We will run every rally demonstrations here, every day, till they release our friend.
After the fall of Suharto, the new Indonesian government is moving to improve the country's dreadful human rights image, but not fast enough, according to those still behind the wire.
There is no national reconciliation if there is no release for all political prisoners. It's just the false reform, not the real reform.
Many Indonesians would like to see the cells here occupied instead by the deposed President Suharto and his children. They're alleged to have salted away a family fortune worth tens of billions of pounds made from corruption and nepotism. Not to prosecute, according to the opposition, would be a bad precedent.
If we have a precedent where somebody who has been so corrupt and who has plundered the natural resources can go unpunished, I think this is a very, very bad precedent.
Tonight, rumours that the Suharto children may have fled Indonesia are being firmly denied here. So too are claims that the family may have stashed much of their money into secret Swiss bank accounts. But with the Suharto's sudden fall from power, it does seem increasingly likely that their fortune and the way they made it will be investigated. Ben Brown, BBC News, Jakarta.
European Union foreign ministers have agreed a code of conduct for arms exports. For the first time, all 15 member states are committed to taking account of a government's human rights record before selling weapons to it. Although the code has no legal force, the Foreign Secretary Robin Cook said it would prevent arms buyers from playing off one European country against another.
For Britain's Foreign Secretary, an easier than expected victory today. The code he brokered guides EU members to avoid arms sales to countries where weapons are likely to be used for internal repression or external aggression. And if any country decides to make a sale another has refused on ethical grounds, they'll have to explain the decision. It's not legally binding, but Mr. Cook believes it will work.
But it does mean that any country that wants to apply a different standard from the other member states is going to have to own up to it, is going to have to admit that to the country that turned down the contract in the first place. Not many countries are going to want to do that and do that openly.
But the deal does not give human rights campaigners all they wanted. These demonstrators last year were calling for an end to all arms sales to regimes like Indonesia. The Irish Foreign Minister shares their disappointment and says he'll fight on for a tougher deal.
Well, we wanted a total ban on arms exports to those countries who have a vile human rights record, quite simply. We didn't get that.
Even if further improvements are needed in future, the British government says today's agreement is a substantial step forward. And though the new code would have had no effect on the arms sales in the Sandline controversy, ministers will be hoping that today's success will help them restore confidence in their so-called ethical foreign policy. Emma Udwin, BBC News, Brussels.
Hong Kong's pro-democracy parties have made sweeping gains in the territory's first elections under Chinese rule. The leader of the Democrats in the legislature, Martin Lee, said the people of Hong Kong had sent a clear message to Beijing calling for more democracy. In the poll, only 20 of the Assembly's 60 seats were elected by popular vote. Motorists are being encouraged to cut down their exhaust fumes in a government scheme aimed at reducing air pollution. They're to be offered free exhaust emission tests in 8 areas: Belfast, Westminster, Bristol, Birmingham, Canterbury, Middlesbrough, Swansea and Glasgow. The scheme will start in July.
Motorists have been stopped for roadside tests on their exhaust in some areas since January. If your car exceeds the emissions limits set down in the MOT test, you can be fined £60. From July, new test centres in the same areas will provide free exhaust tests. The government hopes it will improve disappointing results.
Around a quarter of vehicles tested are failing the tests. These are often, they're often taxis, they're often heavy goods vehicles, they're often older cars, and frankly, poor running, poor tuning is a considerable factor as well.
The government is promising a big expansion in testing. Councils can give drivers who fail roadside tests 14 days to have their cars adjusted instead of paying the fine. But motoring organisations say that too often drivers are simply fined and allowed to go on polluting.
The way it's being run is fundamentally flawed. We need legislation to ensure that that is tightened up so that anybody is producing too many emissions, there is a check of facility. That way it will secure the support of the general public and be seen as more than a revenue-raising measure and a true environmental measure, which is what the government wants.
The Transport White Paper, due out next month, is expected to tackle vehicle emissions. Ministers are even exploring the idea of low-emission zones in some cities reserved for clean vehicles. The latest action to curb pollution reflects growing concern about the dangers to health posed by smog.
The government estimates that small sooty particles from vehicle exhaust are by themselves responsible for 8,000 premature deaths in Britain each year. It seems ministers are prepared to take unpopular action to change the attitude of motorists to what comes out of their exhaust pipes. Robert Piggott, BBC News, West London.
Colin Montgomery has won the Volvo PGA Golf Championship at Wentworth. The Scot holed this putt for a birdie on the final green to finish one shot ahead of 3 players. It was the first time that he'd won the tournament. The First Division playoff final between Sunderland and Charlton was decided by penalties when the match finished 4-4 after extra time. Charlton won the shootout 7-6 and will play in the Premiership next season.
An estimated 42,000 Sunderland fans travelled to Wembley today, ensuring a record crowd for a playoff final. With a place in the Premiership up for grabs, supporters and managers of Charlton Athletic and Sunderland regarded this match as far more important than the FA Cup final.
There's a lot at stake today for these two clubs, both on and off the field. Success will bring huge financial benefits, with higher gates and millions of pounds in television revenue.
Charlton were the more confident side during a scrappy opening, and it took them just 23 minutes to go ahead. Clive Mendonca scoring his 26th of the season. It was a lead they held until just after half-time, when an unstoppable header from Niall Quinn changed the shape of the game. 8 minutes later, Sunderland took the lead through Kevin Phillips, his 35th of the season, a club record. Both sides scored again to make it 3-2 to Sunderland. But amid extraordinary drama, Richard Rufus emerged from nowhere to score his first ever goal for Charlton and take the game into extra time. Nicky Summerby soon restored the Rearsiders' lead, but the celebrations had barely died down when that man Mendonca completed the first hat-trick in a playoff final to leave the teams facing a penalty shootout to secure promotion. The tension was simply too much for some supporters as the first 13 penalties were all converted. But then came the moment that mattered. The save by Ilic sending Charlton back into the top flight for the first time since 1990, while Sunderland can only ponder the agony of another season in Division 1. Paul Newman, BBC News.
And the main news tonight, the Japanese emperor has arrived in Britain for his controversial state visit. That's all from the newsroom tonight. Good night.
Good evening. Police have tonight arrested a man in connection with the murder of a 44-year-old woman found stabbed at her flat in North London. Sharon Sweeney was found yesterday at her home in Islington after the ambulance service received an anonymous call. A rail company is defending a special offer which led to travel chaos for thousands of the region's day trippers. More than 20,000 people took up the offer of £1 a ticket on the Thameslink network yesterday. There were long delays at Brighton station when hundreds turned up at the same time. Thameslink says the problem was partly caused by fare dodgers and denies the promotion was badly planned.
There's always a possibility when trains are busy that you get people travelling for free, and then with other people who had decided to travel on the day to go to other destinations, we are a turn up and go railway and we don't turn anybody away. So that caused extra people, but we'll have a full inquiry into it this week, but we're pleased with the response that we had.
12 members of Britain's oldest bell-ringing society have tonight succeeded in matching a record-breaking peal at Southwark Cathedral in central London. The record had been set nearly 75 years ago, only to be proved invalid some years later.
For much of the day, the bells rang loud at Southwark Cathedral. It took the bell ringers of the Ancient Society of College Youths exactly 9 hours and 41 minutes to equal the record set nearly 75 years ago. But that became invalid when it was realised a peal had been repeated. Today, the team faced a gruelling non-stop challenge, pulling bells weighing a total of 10 tonnes. Not even toilet breaks were permitted. Now the record has been matched, the 12-strong team will be recuperating with a well-earned drink. Jonathan Sundberg, Newsroom South East, Southwark Cathedral.
Football and Charlton fans are celebrating their side's promotion to the Premier League tonight after a nail-biting playoff final at Wembley.
As Charlton fans flooded out of the stadium, the celebrations began. It was pure elation after more than 2 hours of tension. The relief came after 13 successful penalties when Charlton keeper Sasha Ilic made the save that sends his side into the Premier League.
I never ever want to go through anything like that again. It was worse than childbirth. It was agony. But Sasha Ilic.
I can't believe it. We won on penalties and it was just absolutely great.
Fine. I didn't even watch the penalties. I just sat down and wrapped my face in the flag and just prayed, and it worked.
It caps a remarkable comeback for a side that became homeless after it fell from the top flight. Charlton's success today is worth millions to them, and next season they'll need it to compete with the biggest clubs in the country. Keir Simmons, Newsroom South East.
And well done to them. We're back in Business Breakfast tomorrow morning, and don't forget there's South East news around the clock on CFAX page 160. From all of us, a very good night to you.
Good evening to you. Cooler and much less settled weather is beginning to set in across the country. We've had showery outbreaks of rain coming along during the afternoon into the evening. Those there were quite heavy with thunder. Some more organised showers now beginning to move down across Scotland. There's the first front that gave those showers. That'll move away. But these ones will come on down across the country, bringing those outbreaks of rain. But following along behind across a good part of Scotland will be much drier and clearer weather. And if you get a little bit of shelter from that stiff breeze that'll be picking up, temperatures could dip down to a chilly 3 degrees, but fairly mild elsewhere. During the course of tomorrow, those fronts continue to march on southwards. bringing behind that quite cool northerly wind, and a real strong wind too in the north of Scotland. So we're going to have reasonably bright conditions to begin with in Scotland, but the showers packing into the northeast there, and those showers getting heavier and more frequent as time goes on. Outbreaks of rain just moving away from Northern Ireland and southern Scotland first thing, but showery outbreaks of rain across much of England and Wales, soon moving down I think into the south, where some could turn out to be quite heavy with thunder again. But as they move down to the south, somewhat drier, brighter weather will come into the rest of Northern Ireland, into northern parts of England and Wales. A chilly breeze picking up though during the course of the day, temperatures in most parts a fair bit lower, and a cool outlook with showers and longer outbreaks of rain.